Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Who Knew? As you know, we had a change in our interview plans, so we're especially excited to welcome resident Art Thomas to our Who Knew stage. Today, Reverend Dr. Art Thomas, an adjunct professor of spirituality and church history at Wesley Theological Seminary, will be interviewed by friend and fellow resident Susan Albert. Before we get going with the interview, I'd like to remind everyone that we are airing today's program live on TV 970, but we also have our live audience. So as time permits after the interview, we would be glad to take questions from our audience. And now I will turn it over to Susan and Art.
Thank you. I appreciate you all coming today and appreciate you all who are listening on 970. And especially appreciate Art stepping up at the last minute to provide this service for us today. He's worked hard in a short period of time, and he's used to working hard, but this was not a long time frame for him. The Reverend Dr. Arthur D. Thomas, Jr. grew up in Richmond, where he attended collegiate school, West Hampton Junior High, and Thomas Jefferson High School. He received his BA in history from the College of William and Mary, his Master's of Divinity from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in Massachusetts, his MA in Christian Education and Spirituality from Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C., his Master of Theology and PhD in Church History from Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond. He was ordained as a minister of the Presbyterian Church U.S. in 1979, where he served as pastor in churches in Culpeper and Salem. He later transferred his credentials into the United Methodist Church in 1996, where he served pastorates in Maryland and Virginia. Since 1994 to the present, Art has served as adjunct professor of spirituality and church history at Wesley Theological Seminary. From 1996 to 2017, he was professor of spirituality at the Ecumenical Institute of Theology of St. Mary's Seminary and University. Following retirement from pastoral ministry in 2019, he continues to write books and articles, lecture and preach at churches and groups. He has published about 4 articles, 4 books, and is working on the Second Great Awakening in Virginia and slavery reform. He has directed the restoration of historic Presbyterian and Methodist structures in Maryland and Virginia. He has led 9 European art and spirituality tours of Europe and has served as spiritual director to many. As a retired minister, he worships and teaches at Reveille United Methodist Church and also assists with projects at River Road United Methodist and St. Giles Presbyterian churches. He has enjoyed preaching at Westminster Canterbury and leading a spiritual classics study group. Art, tell me about growing up in Richmond.
Well, I grew up in Richmond, Virginia. My family has deep roots in the area. Many of the branches settled in Virginia around Henrico, New Kent, Hanover, and later in Richmond, the 17th century. I did go to collegiate school and West Hampton Junior High School. It's kind of interesting how some of these early teachers you have a great impact upon your life, because at collegiate school I learned to love ancient history and European history in the 4th and 5th grade. And then at West Hampton Junior High School, Miss Louise Galvin, I don't know if any of you ever studied under her, but she really told the history in story form and took us on field trips all over the state of Virginia. So I really started to get very interested in history as a result, and also doing some genealogical research when I was in high school. Also, in growing up in Richmond, I became very interested in French, and so I took many courses in French and was president of the French club. And then I also, growing up in Richmond, was very, very blessed to have a good Presbyterian church where I was really seeking the faith. I was going through a period of agnosticism, and I took the confirmation class hoping to find answers, faith, seeking understanding. And it was really through my minister sharing a painting by Holman Hunt of Christ, the light of the world, which is in St. Paul's Cathedral in London, him knocking on the door that he read to us, Revelation 3:20, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone opens the door, I will come in to him and feast with him." And through that sharing, I had a very profound sense of assurance of God's love and the reality of God. So I guess all of those things were very influential. It was interesting. I did a vocational guidance training, and at the 7th grade, they said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to be either a teacher or a librarian." I didn't have the concept of ordained ministry at the time, but I later did become an archivist for a short time, and I certainly became a teacher, preacher, seminary teacher. So it's interesting how, in your early days, people can have an impact on you. My aunt, Elizabeth Thomas, was a librarian at the Library of Virginia, and she was always giving me books of history for Christmas and birthdays, so I got influence about history through her. Yeah.
Tell us about your call to ministry in the Presbyterian Church.
Well, that's an interesting story. I was asked to be part of a youth Sunday, and I was given a scripture passage from Matthew 23. I've been taking oral interpretation at Thomas Jefferson High School, so I worked really hard preparing to read this in a very dramatic way. When I finished, all these people came up to me and said, "Art, you really should go into the ministry." And I said, "Oh, well, no." And my government teacher, Fred Bateman, went to our church, and he said in class the next day, "Art, are you going into the ministry?" I said, no. But it was kind of like the voice of Yahweh getting my attention. And I started to pray and consider that, and the conviction grew more and more of God's call. I was examined by Hanover Presbytery, now Presbytery of the James, and received as a candidate for ordained ministry. I was ordained in 1979, and it's very interesting. At the time of my ordination, my grandmother told me, before you were born, I had dedicated your life to ministry in the church. I said, "What?" My aunt told me, my grandfather, Thomas, who was one of the founders of Tabernacle Baptist, had prayed all of his life that a minister would be raised up in the Thomas family. And I said, "Well, I didn't know that." "We didn't tell you." So maybe God was at work behind the scenes, and I didn't recognize it.
Who were the influential people in your seminary education?
Well, there are so many that it's hard to narrow them down, but when I was at the College of William and Mary, David Holmes, a religion professor, had a great impact on me because he was a specialist in American religious history. In fact, my doctoral dissertation came out of a lot of things that he taught me about the revival in the Episcopal Church in Virginia under Bishop William Meade and Richard Channing Moore. I've kept up with David Holmes. I just saw him recently. And then when I got to Union Seminary, two professors were very influential. One was James H. Smiley, who lived here at Westminster Canterbury and was here when I moved in. His wife Elizabeth is still a resident in Avalon. And James Smiley helped me to learn the history of religion in America, theology, revival history, and also he taught me a lot about social justice and social reform movements in American religious history and directed my doctoral dissertation. He really became a mentor to me and imparted many of his values to me as well. Also, I was very thrilled to study under Ross Mackenzie, who is a resident here. So I just can't believe that I was so fortunate to have two professors still around when I moved in, and he was my professor of patristics and medieval and Reformation studies, and taught me some things about the history of Christian spirituality, and influenced me in the lines of the ecumenical movement, the appreciation of the Catholic and Orthodox tradition, the Anglican and Reformed tradition. So I'm very thankful to him. Also, there was Dr. Albert Carey Wynn. Some of you may have heard of him at Second Presbyterian Church, taught a tremendous course on Christian classics. And that became the foundation for a lot of the teaching that I've done in seminary. Then later on, I went to study at Regent College in Vancouver for a number of semesters under James M. Houston. Dr. Houston had been in a small group with C.S. Lewis when they both taught at Oxford University. And he would meet with Lewis and others, and they would discuss theology. He eventually founded Regent College in Vancouver and really influenced me to look at C.S. Lewis as a role model for doing theology and reaching lay people. But I wanted to study under Dr. Houston because I'd been studying a lot of spirituality among Catholics, and I wanted to see a Protestant evangelical model of how you would teach spiritual theology and courses on prayer and the spiritual disciplines and the history of spirituality. He also served as the spiritual director and guide for me, and I published 2 articles on his approach to spirituality and the influence of C.S. Lewis upon him. Another important person was Dr. Robin Moss, who was teaching at Wesley Seminary. She was a United Methodist who converted to Catholicism, and she taught this course along with an Eastern Orthodox theologian on spiritual theology. It's a systematic approach to the spiritual life, the ascetical and mystical theology. I just found that she really influenced me greatly, and then I eventually started to teach her class when she retired from Wesley Seminary. And the last person that really impacted me was Catherine A. Kapikian, who has been a leader in spreading the message about the incorporation of the arts in theological education and in the church. She developed a program at Wesley Seminary where there were courses in studio art, art and spirituality, church music, liturgical drama, liturgical dance taught by Catherine Sparks, the daughter of Annette and Ben Sparks. And so we started to team teach together art and spirituality, and helped me to see that I loved art history, and I'd kind of suppress this, saying, well, this doesn't really fit with what I'm doing. But she was saying, no, use the visual arts when you teach. Use the paintings, and that will bring your lectures to life. So we taught a course. We studied different people like Francis of Assisi and his influence upon Giotto. Or we'd study Ignatius Loyola and his spirituality influencing El Greco and Bernini and so forth. So it was interesting to put these different concepts together.
Art, tell us about your call to teach in theological seminary on spiritual formation and church history.
Well, that's an interesting story. When I graduated from Union Seminary in 1981, I felt like I really had been called to be a Presbyterian pastor, and I was very eager to go into the pastorate and preach and to have that experience serving in that capacity. But in my second pastorate, when I was at New Hope Presbyterian Church in Salem, Virginia, I noticed that there was a group of people there from the Shalem Institute of Spiritual Formation, and they were critiquing how they were doing their spiritual direction. So I said, could I be part of that group? And they said, sure. And so through that, I started to feel a real interest of going more deeply in spirituality. I'd been exposed to some of that in my church history classes at Union and at Gordon Conwell, and even at William and Mary. I did training in spiritual classics. But I wanted to go more deeply. So after a time of praying and discerning God's will, I decided I would take the plunge. I would sell my house, liquidate all my financial resources, go back to Washington, D.C., to Wesley Seminary, where I could not only study there, they had some excellent scholars in the field that I wanted to concentrate in, but there were also people over at Catholic University, Washington Theological Union, Virginia Theological Seminary, the Lutheran Seminary in Gettysburg. And so I was able to study a lot of spirituality and Christian education up there. So as I did it, a lot of people said, well, Art, you're making a big mistake. There are no positions in spirituality in Protestant seminaries. Well, I just had this sense that that was my destiny, my calling, and I went on and did it. A lot of times I felt kind of fearful. Maybe I was wasting a lot of money and time. But one day I was praying and I just felt God speaking to me inwardly. No, the reason I've created you, Art, is to teach on the spiritual life, period. So I had this sense, trust in this call, go through it, doors will open. Well, I never applied for any job that I've had in teaching. People kept come to me and said, would you teach? So Wesley Seminary had me start, first of all, in 1992, teaching in the course of studies school, in the basic church history class. And then in 1994, I was hired on as an adjunct professor. And they said, well, we'd like you to be the director of archives and history and archivist of this premier collection of Methodist historical writings. It's in the Lovely Lane Church in Baltimore, where Sanford White, the great architect, built this church to look like a Benedictine Abbey from Pomposa, Italy. And so I did that job, and the Methodists said, we'll take you, you're a Presbyterian, we'll take you. You can be a Presbyterian minister preaching in a Methodist church part-time. You can be the archivist, and you can teach in seminary. And I kept trying Presbyterian churches, and so that door didn't open. So anyway, I was just really excited about moving in this direction and having the opportunity studying and teaching. And then the Catholic Seminary, the Ecumenical Institute of Theology in Baltimore, which was founded in 1968 after Vatican II to bring Protestants and Catholics together to teach in an ecumenical way for a master's degree. So I was asked to be professor of Christian spirituality there, following Eugene Peterson, who had occupied that position for so many years. And that was a wonderful experience of teaching with Catholics and Protestants and dialoguing with them and growing together. We also sometimes had Jewish students as well. So I got into teaching at Wesley and the Ecumenical Institute. And I mean, I really had a busy schedule being a pastor. I gave up the archivist position eventually, but I was generally teaching 2 seminary courses a semester plus my full-time teaching ministry. And it was a lot of work, but I really loved it.
Art, would you define for us spirituality and spiritual formation?
I'd be glad to. A lot of people don't know this term, spirituality, but it means lived experience with God. And you study writings of the mystics, the people who have written devotional classics like Thomas à Kempis or Augustine. You talk about the spiritual disciplines like prayer, fasting, meditation, contemplative prayer, centering prayer, various things like that. So it's a different approach to the spiritual life. We normally have in theological education systematic theology, moral theology or ethics. The Catholics also had what they called ascetical and mystical theology, which is the theology of the spiritual life. And so this is, a lot of Protestant seminaries are now seeing that they need to do this. Calvin had a whole section in the Institute on the Christian life and developing that. And then spiritual direction is a way of counseling people, helping them to discern God's call in their life and reflect upon their experiences with God. And when we say spiritual formation, it's really how do you teach and encourage people to grow spiritually and morally and to engage with this particular subject.
Art, tell us about your role in the restoration and furnishing of historic church-related structures and museum work in Virginia and Maryland, and I know you have some slides for us.
Yes, one of the fringe benefits of the jobs that I had was doing some historic restoration. When I became the director of Archives and History, the Lovely Lane Museum, one of my projects was the restoration of this 1760s home of John Evans, which is where the first Methodist class meeting in the New World met. And so we have the intact building. It's still standing. We stabilized the structure. There I am on the right with some other friends. We would do reenactments of some of the figures of colonial Methodism. But my job was to furnish the home in authentic reproductions of what it would look like in 1760s, 1770s. So I ran across a person by the name of Bill Brown, who had been a specialist for the Park Service in furnishing historic structures. We had the inventory of the estate of John Evans, and so he developed a scheme of exactly what type of furniture we needed to buy. So this shows the table where the original Methodist class met. They met around it. They would ask each other, how does your soul prosper? What struggles have you met with? What prayer requests do you have? And there was a little pulpit over there where a visiting itinerant minister could preach. But they did it all in the same room, and we had these beds with the, curtains. Everything had to be authentic. Everything had to be woven on a loom, and it was just really interesting to learn about the period furnishings. I had an artist from England who did a whole cycle of paintings on the early Methodist history. Another project I had earlier was at Mitchell's Presbyterian Church in Culpeper County, Virginia. And when I arrived, I was thrilled to be able to work on church history and to write the history of the church. But an Italian artist named Joseph Odanino painted the interior in 1888. There were a lot of the Somerville family. They were the ancestors of Dr. James Somerville of First Baptist, who had traveled in Europe, and they wanted to beautify the church. And so this artist, who was Catholic, brought together, and he painted cross beams in trompe-l'oeil style, French for deceive the eye. It's illusionistic painting. So it's painted to look like you have real Corinthian columns, a real baldacchino, and it's considered a very rare example of architecture. So we had Milton Grigg and Richard Guy Wilson from the University of Virginia in architecture to help us on this project, and also David Holmes and Leslie Cheek and a number of people, and we were able to get this restored, and it's a real gem. Recently, I'm working on the restoration of the Edward Drumgoole home, which is in Brunswick County, which is Southside, Virginia. And I'm writing an article on Edward Drumgoole Sr., who was one of the early Methodist preachers in colonial and early American times. We didn't have a portrait of him, and I thought one day, but we do have a portrait of his son, who was a congressman. I bet Emma Lou Martin, I could twist her arm and get her to paint a portrait. So I had to show her paintings of all kinds of Methodist ministers of the time and different styles of clothing. And I brought in Claudia Kidwell, who lives here, who had worked at the Smithsonian in different styles of clothing, and Pat Archer, who had worked at the John Marshall House as curator, and myself, and we put this together, and Emma Lou painted it, and Bob Coles photographed it. So I'm just saying I make use of Westminster Canterbury talent when I do these things. So this is going to hang when we finish restoring the home, and it's going to be displayed at different institutions. And it's on exhibit in the hall here at Westminster Canterbury now, so you might want to go and look at it. So we do thank Emma Lou and all of those people for helping on that.
Art, where is it on display?
It's on the first floor of the tower, where you have all the portrait exhibits that Sarah Abernathy has put up with the residents' artwork. Yeah.
What about your current writing and publications?
All right, well, that's interesting. I've published about 40 articles. Some of them are short articles, but and some books, but I'm working on a church history, and I'm working on my doctoral dissertation that I wrote way back with Jim Smiley on the Second Great Awakening in Virginia and slavery reform. And I could publish as it was, but with George Floyd and all the investigation of racial injustice and the evils of slavery, I felt like I needed to revisit what I had written and kind of reinterpret it. And so I've been doing more and more research on it. I put out a call for help, and two Westminster Canterbury residents, Joanna Pendleton and Jean Baer, helped to retype the 650-page dissertation so that I could start using that to revise it. But I hope it's going to be very helpful, because we look at a lot of the oppression, but I'm looking at what many of the Christians did to achieve abolition, to preach and teach about abolition of slavery, and what some of them did, if they couldn't set the slaves free, what they did to ameliorate or improve the living condition for the enslaved, or how to teach them reading and writing, or prepare them with a trade so that they would be ready for freedom. So some wanted to emancipate slaves immediately, some wanted to free slaves gradually, or to emancipate them and send them to Liberia, Africa. So it's a very complex story of the Methodists, the Baptists, the Presbyterians, and the Episcopalians. Some really fascinating figures in there, a lot of artwork and portraits, and so as soon as I get through my current project, I'm going to go back to that and hope to have that finished. But I do keep, and then I eventually want to write a textbook on spiritual theology, if I can get all this in my, but I just keep praying that I can get all this writing finished. Thank you. Yeah.
Tell us about those 9 UK and European tours.
Yeah, that was something that I really enjoyed with Catherine Kapikian. We had taught this course on art and spirituality, and we decided, wouldn't it be neat to have some tours where students could incorporate and experience this. And so our first tour was to Italy, and specializing in the Italian Renaissance. We had doctoral students from Wesley and master's level students that went. We went to the monasteries and the cathedrals and the great art museums and interviewed people. Then we did tours of art and spirituality in France and Germany and the Low Countries. Maybe our most popular was our 2 tours on Celtic spirituality in Ireland and the British Isles. People just really were excited about Celtic spirituality. And when we went to the Holy Isle of Iona, we had Philip Newell to lecture to us there and show us around. So that was a high point of that experience. And then I got to, we always did worship services in historic places. So at Lindisfarne, I put on chasuble, a Celtic chasuble, and helped officiate at a Celtic Eucharist with an Anglican priest. And we always had we had lectures on the bus, and then we had, the tour guides that would interpret things, and we would discuss them. So we did all kinds of countries in Europe, and the art, architecture, spirituality, the great writers, the great reformers. It was, just people who took my tours sometimes complained that I crammed all that could possibly be crammed into one day, and I didn't allow much time for shopping. but you really got your money's worth if you went on one of these tours, because you saw things that no other tour included. So.
Art, why did you choose Westminster for your retirement years?
Well, I was, my mother had lived here. My aunt had lived here. My aunt moved in here about 1977 or 78. So I'd been coming to Westminster Canterbury from 1978 to 2011 when my Aunt Martha Thomas died. And it was almost like a second home for me. I loved the rich liturgical life, the spirituals, the chaplains, the programs, the men's discussion group, the emphasis on the arts and the cultural life. And it was near Union Seminary. I wanted to go back to Virginia after living in Maryland for about 25 years. They say once a Virginian, always a Virginian. So I had to come back to Richmond. And I've been very happy here, working with different groups here and getting to know so many residents whose lives have really enriched me, friendships that I've developed, and so forth and so on.
And what other activities have you been involved in here, Art?
Well, I've been in the men's discussion group, centering prayer group, Lectio Divina group. I've preached here. I gave a lectureship the first year I came in some of the saints of the church. So that's what I've done. And there was one other question we had.
I think you already covered that, your transfer of your ordination.
No, I haven't. No.
I'm sorry, I thought you did.
Okay.
Why did you transfer your ordination from the Presbyterian Church to the United Methodist Church?
Yeah, Susan and I talked about that as a possible question, because a lot of people ask me that. How could a staunch Presbyterian change to Methodism? Well, it kind of goes back to, I was filling in for Ross McKenzie one time in his basic church history class, and he said, "What would you like to lecture on?" I said, "I'd like to do John Wesley and dress up like John Wesley and give a talk like I'm speaking, like I'm actually John Wesley, come back from the dead speaking." So I was studying that in the class with him and Jim Smiley. And one of the students came up to me afterwards and said, "I'm so impressed with John Wesley, I've decided to become a Methodist." And I said, "Well, I didn't mean to do that to you. I don't want you to leave the Presbyterian Church." But I was baptized at Ganner Park Methodist Church as a baby, and then my parents became Presbyterian. And when I went to Wesley Seminary to study, I also did some study at Virginia Theological Seminary in Alexandria on Anglican spirituality. And I, for a while, felt the lure of the Episcopal Church and also of the Methodist Church. I did a paper on John Wesley as a spiritual director, and I became very impressed with his vision for the spiritual life. He published classics of Christian spirituality from the early church, medieval church, the Anglican, the Puritans, the Pietists, the Evangelicals, the Lutherans, and the mystics, and so on. And I really liked his use of small groups and accountable discipleship. So I said, I was trying to process why I was being drawn in this direction. Well, when I finished the master's program at Wesley, I said, well, let's see, they want me to teach. I've always wanted to teach in seminary. And I tried to get placement in a Presbyterian church in the Washington, D.C. area. I did not succeed in that. But the Methodists said, as I mentioned earlier, we'll open up the doors and we'll invite you to preach and be a pastor in our church. So after 2 years serving as a Presbyterian in a Methodist church, I decided to take the plunge and switch over. And it's not because I don't like the Presbyterian church. I'm so grateful for all that I have learned from that tradition. And many people say you preach like a Presbyterian more than a Methodist. Well, I guess I was Presbyterian minister for a long time and had a lot of Presbyterian training. But I'm just very thankful that the Methodists were open to allowing someone like me to do this seminary teaching and to move and to use so many of my gifts. I found that Presbyterians wanted you to be full-time pastor and nothing else. But the Methodists said you can work 10 hours a week outside the church and still be a full-time pastor, which meant pretty much I gave my day off and part of another day to doing the seminary teaching. But that's why it was kind of a call to the spirituality of John Wesley, the temptation to become an Episcopalian, but I felt that Wesley had he brought in the evangelical spirituality and also the rich liturgical life. So what I did as a Methodist, I was kind of a Methodist with kind of an Episcopal flavor because I used processional crosses and acolytes and albs and stoles, and we had a rich experience of the church year, and which many Methodists are like that. They have that Anglican stream, and some are more in the revivalistic camp. So it was a good fit for me, and I'm very thankful for that transition. I also like the appointment system, where the bishop sends you to a particular church, and the Presbyterian is the call system where, a church has to come and decide who they want as the pastor, and I just kind of trusted in the process that God was at work in the bishops appointing me to a place, and it worked out pretty well for me.
Art, you've had a remarkably productive life and successful one, and we really appreciate your sharing those experiences with us.
Okay.
And I'm wondering if there are any questions now from the group.
And if you raise your hand, Jessica can come around with a microphone. So I know we did cover a lot, but if there's anything else burning you need to know. We've got one. All right, Dusty, here we come.
Wow. I just wondered on your tours that you took your students to Europe, ballpark about how many were in a group? Were they smallish or, like 10 or more, 20, or how many did you have when you were, I'd love to go on one tomorrow.
Okay. Well, it kind of varied. The Italian Renaissance tour, we had, I think, 46 people. We actually had 2 buses. And that was because I would bring students from both the Ecumenical Institute and Wesley together, and their family and friends. So I had a lot of people who weren't seminary students. But the smallest group I had was 20, and that was the tour of Ireland and Celtic spirituality in Ireland. But the one tour that I tried to offer, I didn't get enough people for, was was going to Wesley's England and another one on John Calvin's Geneva. I had almost had enough people from here to do the John Calvin's Geneva, and one person dropped out. We had to have 10, so I had to cancel that. I haven't done any more since then, but it was a lot of fun. We had, on one of the tours to Spain, we had to interview a Muslim imam, a Jewish rabbi, a politician, and we talked to abbots from monasteries, and so we tried to immerse ourselves in the culture and civilization. When we went to France, we went to the Taizé community, or we worshipped with some of the monks in the ancient monasteries, or went to some of the great cathedrals and studied that way. It just was just kind of a rich experience. I do think those larger groups were kind of overwhelming for me to keep up with all those people and their needs. So I think really 20 or 25 is a better group size than that. Yeah.
Art, do you see spirituality as some kind of higher level of Christian experience than most ordinary church people?
That's a good question. I see it as an important part. I don't know whether it's a higher level, but it's certainly an important part of the Christian experience. As you look through the history of the church, you are, I guess I'm drawn to study people's experiences, their autobiographies, their journals, their mystical visions, experiences, their philosophy, the theology, and also feeling that I found that in the 1960s and 70s when I was growing up, a lot of people were very much into social justice causes, which were very good and wonderful, but many of them lacked the spirituality component, and some people got burned out. So I think we need to nourish the inner spiritual journey of knowing ourselves. I have students write their spiritual autobiography using all of the concepts that we've studied in spiritual theology, and that helps them to know themselves and to learn how they can teach this in the local congregation. So I do find there is a great hunger among people to learn some models for small group interaction, discussion. I like the Renovare approach of Richard Foster and Dallas Willard and James Bryan Smith and others who have put together some remarkable programs for studying the spiritual life. And I guess I feel like this emphasis on spirituality is a return to some aspects of John Calvin, the Puritans, the Pietists in the Protestant tradition. It's and I also found many students, women students, were very drawn to studying the voices of the mystics, like Hildegard of Bingen that Bill Blake was speaking about this week, and Julian of Norwich, and Hadwick of Antwerp, and Teresa of Avila, and so on. They were looking for these authentic voices. So, and at Wesley, we have electives in spirituality, but they do have a requirement for graduation for all Master Divinity students, which is they learn to have the Wesley class meeting in which you develop a covenant of your spiritual exercises and programs, like you'll worship once a week, read your Bible a certain amount of time, fast, be involved in social ministry or something like that, and you talk and discuss how you're living out the covenant. So Wesley Seminary has really put a great emphasis on spiritual formation, and I've been very blessed to be part of that program.
Any other questions? All right, well, before we conclude, I would like to remind everyone that our November Who Knew will feature actress and cabaret star Suzanne Pollard, who will be interviewed by resident Ann Archer. So with that, I'd like to thank you both, and thank you, Dr. Thomas, for sharing so much with us today. And as always, if you see Dr. Thomas in the hall, feel free to ask him any burning questions that you may have. So thank you both, and hope everyone has a great day.